Do you find it hard to keep up with your teacher or to recall information once the class is over? Hi, I'm Aidan with the Gwinnett County Public Library, and today I'm going to share with you the secrets to effective note-taking. Note-taking is simple, right? You sit down in the class, you listen to the teacher, and you put down everything they say on a piece of paper. Except it doesn't quite work that way. In reality, note-taking is much more than simply a record of everything a teacher says. It's about helping you understand the connections between pieces of information, prioritizing material, and helping you recall it efficiently later. To get the most out of a class, you want to make sure that your notes are clear, concise, and well organized. The good news is there's been a heap of research already done into the most effective ways to make notes. And today we're going to be talking about 3 of the most popular strategies: the Cornell Method, outlining, and mind maps. Now, before we begin, I need to acknowledge that today we're going to be talking about using pen and paper, but not everyone does this anymore. However, even if you're using a piece of software like Google Documents or Evernote, many of the tips and strategies we're going to talk about today are still going to be useful. Let's start by talking about the Cornell Method. Now, this was developed in the 1940s by a professor in education studies at Cornell University. This was designed for use predominantly in a lecture or classroom setting. You start by dividing your sheet of paper into sections. You want to place a horizontal line about 2 inches up from the bottom of the page. Then divide the top half with a vertical line about 2.5 inches from the left edge of the page. It's going to look something like this. Each section of your page serves a different purpose. Your biggest section in the top right is going to be your main note-taking area. This is where you're going to write brief notes about the key points that the speaker is making. Don't try to write down everything the speaker says. You want to think in terms of bullet points, paraphrase and use abbreviations whenever possible. If there are any formulas or diagrams, try and sketch them out quickly here as well. The column to the left of the note-taking column is your cue column. This is your chance to draw out key names, vocabulary, or questions that you think may come up on a future test. You will make use of this as soon as class is over. I want to really stress at this point how important it is to revisit your notes as soon as possible after the lesson or lecture. That way the information will be as fresh as possible in your mind. Our final stage will be to reread and summarize the information on the page in this section down at the bottom. Exactly what this will look like depends a little on the type of material you are studying, but the point is that you want to say what is important in the information written above. This is not only a great way to make sure of your understanding, it's also really useful when you're quickly reviewing your notes months later, helping you find the most relevant pages. Now, once you've done this a few times, you're probably not going to need to keep drawing physical lines on the paper. You'll probably be able to estimate just by looking at the page roughly how much room you need to leave. But the first few times you do it, I strongly recommend drawing those lines because it helps you visualize exactly how much room is necessary. Now, next we're going to be talking about the outlining method. Like the Cornell method, this is highly useful in a lecture situation, but also very helpful when you're reading and making notes on a text. The essence of outlining is that you make your notes in a nested bullet point system. When this system is used well, it can be tremendously effective, allowing you to capture lots of very specific information that you can then look back at and recall later. Now, this organizational method works really well when someone is speaking to prepared remarks or when you're reading from a text, but it doesn't work quite so well when someone is speaking off the cuff, because if they're not following a very rigid structure, you may find that they jump between points. And this can make it difficult to know exactly how much room you need to leave, because what if they return to a topic later in the lecture? For this reason, I think it best when you're in a classroom setting to use the Cornell method, and I tend to use the outlining method when I'm making notes from a prepared text. But in all cases, what's really important is what works for you. The final method of note-taking we're going to be talking about today is called mind mapping. Now, this is a highly visual style of note-taking, and It can sometimes resemble a brainstorming chart, where you make a note in the middle and you have little lines going off from it, recording thoughts in different directions. For this reason, it can be really effective to use this in a form like a seminar or a question and answer session, where people aren't following a structure at all, and where you need to be able to quickly jump from one topic to another. Instead of starting at the top of the page, we're going to begin in the middle by writing down the topic or the subject of our lesson. Now, if you already know the subject to be discussed, you can actually get a head start by writing out some topics that are likely to be covered and connecting them to the middle. In my example, we're looking at the fall of the Roman Empire, and I know that we're going to be breaking down the reasons into political, military, and economic. So I can actually get started before anything's been discussed by just writing down those broad areas. As ideas are raised, we create branches off from those ideas. For instance, issues with recruitment of soldiers would fall under the military category. Now, I'm pretty sure you'll see immediately that what this method is not suited to is capturing great amounts of detail about the points that you're making. You're talking about very short ideas. What this does really well, though, is illustrate the connections between them. For example, you might find that some of the causes that we're talking about in my example interact with one another or feed into them, and so we can draw connections between them. That's one of the reasons that this is such a powerful visual tool, because it gives us a greater understanding of how these ideas are interconnected. Now, I will say, don't be afraid to experiment with these styles. Mix them up and see what works best for you. You might find that an adaptation of one of these methods works better for you than adhering to the typical way it's done. But you won't know unless you try. However, regardless of which technique you end up using, I think there are some very broad tips and tricks I can give you that will help you make the most out of your note-taking. The first of these is that if your teacher gives you a syllabus, take a look at it in advance of your class so that you know the areas that are likely to be discussed. That's going to make it easier for you to understand what topics are going to be most relevant in your notes, so that you don't waste time recording things that might be completely irrelevant. Secondly, don't try to write everything down. Unless you're working from a recording, this would be pretty much impossible anyway, because humans speak at about 120 words per minute, much faster than most of us can handwrite or even type. Instead, try and focus on what material is the most important, and concentrate on capturing that and making the connections between material. Lastly, and I cannot stress this enough, make sure you revisit your notes as soon as possible after your class or lecture. Look back over them and make sure that everything you wrote makes sense. Sometimes in the moment you'll use a kind of shorthand to help you capture as much information as possible, but you may want to expand on that or make connections with other things in your reading. The best time to do this is as soon as possible after class. For more information on successful studying techniques, check out these materials available from the library. Finally, thank you for joining me for today's session. I wish you every success in the new academic year. Thank you.